month sabbatical. It's a wonderful time. Thank you also for Iris for hosting this seminar and to all of you for coming. What I'm presenting now is pretty much the thinking I've been doing in the last couple of months. I've been working on farm resilience for quite a while, but as it is, the further you dig, the more questions open themselves up and the more uncertainties you are and like, well, I'm not sure that's really quite the answer, so you keep going. And I'm now trying to take a post-structuralist view. I'm looking forward to all your questions because since I'm just writing up these papers, everything that's going to help me to sharpen my thinking is most welcome. I've written the name of my institute here just for you to know that I have a background in economics. So when I refer to economics, it's not so much as a critical, but that's the thinking I know best. And I often position what I do in relation to that. It's not as a critique, but more to see that where the differences and the contrasts are. So for those who don't know resilience, I do follow the school by Buzz Holling, which comes from UBC at that time. It is social ecological resilience. That's a definition that most people refer to when they work. It's by Walker from 2004. So the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. Well, that's when it gets complicated, and when I try to apply this, which has been developed mostly by ecologists, onto the farm as a social ecological system, there are some adaptations that are necessary, but essentially you have absorbed disturbance, that's essentially the ability to buffer shocks. Adapt to change is also important. Where I differ from, not sure what the function is of a farm in a multifunctional context. What about the trade-offs between the function? How do I work with that? What is the identity of a farm? Difficult to define. And also retaining this essentially means that mostly they don't include transformation as part of resilience. So their old thing is with the bowls and shifting is often the flipping, so transformation, not really resilient. You have a moment where it isn't resilient. I think that in a social ecological system with a social, the transformation is part of it. So essentially, a resilient farm is a farm that has been able to persist through time. And the important thing is it doesn't stay the same through time. It changes all the time through time. Well, many farms don't seem to have that ability. These are the number of farms in Austria, or since 1950. So after the 50s, we had post-war period modernization of agriculture. So you would almost expect them to drop. They're still doing so until now. So in the 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, we lost 41% of our farms. I looked up the numbers for Canada. It was only 26%, but it's still a quarter of the farms that have disappeared in that time. Currently, the average, we're a small country, the average is 19 hectares of utilized agricultural area. That's equivalent to 47 acres. So it is small. They're very cute. We like them. Their disciplinary perspective on this disappearing of farms, and the economists, they think it's a good thing. Because get big or get out, bigger farms are more economical, they can be more efficient, you have economies of scale, that's a good thing, so keep going. Actually, we need to have much larger units because really they don't do much good. Ecologists are not so happy about that because there are two things that happen when farms get bigger. Some of them intensify the production, and that's usually not so good for groundwater and others. The other is that usually areas that are less favorable to agriculture are abandoned. In Austria, this translates into afforestation, and afforestation in our country means a loss of biodiversity. It's probably different in British Columbia. But for us, it's important to keep these alpine meadows open because that's where we have our diversity. Sociologists also don't think it's a particularly good idea because we lose social cohesion in rural areas. There's an erosion of cultural institutions. Obviously, rural areas are not populated just by farmers, but many of the people who live in rural areas are farmers or their families. And if you take them away, there's not that much less, so that the networks in rural areas start to disappear and the institutions that go with that. So in Austria, this is really important. So we are trying to keep farms, not necessarily successfully, but we're trying. Here, just a little reminder where Austria is and how small we are. Austria is about 3 times the size of Vancouver Island. So that's where we're at. That's how Austria looks like. Most people identify Austria with the mountains. We have the best of the Alps. But actually, we have also a lot of flat areas. Just cropping over there, but most people like that. That's the skiing part. And of course, it is Sound of Music landscape. Interestingly enough, the landscape still looks that way if you go to Salzburg. A bit more forest, but really marginally. And you have gentle rolling hill in much of the country. The important thing here is to see that all of that landscape is farmed. It's farmed either by agriculture, in that case it's grassland. You have farms everywhere. And the forests also belong to farmers. Collectively, farmers are the biggest forest owners in Austria. So without farmers, you also don't have managed forests. Tourists really like that kind of landscape, so they come, it's very nice. So we want to keep that landscape. This cultural landscape is really an identity giver for Austria. And this is what family farms look like. It's child labor. Here you have them. It's actually also labor for the elderly. It's everybody helping in. And it's farmers who farm areas which would never be farmed commercially. That little hay, it's never going to be economical to cut this. And then have manual labor. If you start paying wages with that, this can never be economical. That's why all these areas get abandoned by the time that the economic pressures increase. So here again, that's a Dirndl. I didn't come today, my Dirndl, so you'll forgive me, but that's how Austrians in rural areas like to dress up. Multifunctional farms, it's really important that we understand them as having a role way beyond food. Now, it's true that they're important to secure a food supply. We are self-sufficient in Austria in most of the important commodities. I think historically it's been explained by the fact that we've had several wars. We have learned that relying on trade to feed our population is not a very reliable thing. Now, we're just celebrating 70 years of the end of the Second World War, so that's a good thing. But it's still in the institution and the thinking and the policies underlying it. Not officially, because officially you can't discriminate between other EU countries. But it's still been there until 95. It was the first paragraph of the agricultural law. You must feed your people. It's also there to preserve the cultural landscape. Again, as I said, it's biodiversity, it's tourism. Tourism, big income source in Austria, not just for hotels, but also for farmers. We have a lot of farmers who rent out rooms, so it's important for them. The viability in rurals, as I said, rural employment. You want to have your children being able to work at the bakery, maybe become an apprentice there. All this is important. All this is a network. You want to actually have schools. If you don't have farmers, you don't have many children, schools close. And then the post office close. And then the local supermarket close. And then you don't have young families coming anymore. So it's really this downward spiral that we're trying to stop. And obviously traditions and cultures, specialty foods, we like our foods, and our bacon needs to be just like that, and only that farmer will do it just like that, and that's because it's not an industrial production. And obviously we have a lot of cultural associations. Singing is a big thing, so there's a good reason why Sound of Music was made in Austria. We like singing, and you have all these big chorals, and it's an important for cohesion, for people to meet each other. Also, what's important for family farms is they're in for the long term. They inherited in Austria. This particular farm, it's an Erbhof. It's a title that they can wear if they've been in the family for a long time. In that case, for 400 years. They have documentation that one family has managed that farm for 400 years. If you inherit this, you're not going to sell it. You're not going to give it away. You're not going to leave it there. You have a burden of all these people who worked it for it, and you want to give it on. And that's a big difference with economists. Economists plan for 5 to 10 years. After that, you usually don't have calculations anymore. If you're a farmer, 30 years is going to be your horizon. 30 years because that's roughly the time you have it and you manage a farm and then you pass it over. And you want to make sure that it is in a state where your child, where your son, rarely a daughter, will want to take it over. So you want to manage on the long term. So now the question is, what makes a farm resilient? I'm going to present 2 ways that it's often understood. This one is very easy to equate to economics. Essentially, resilience is a property of the physical farm. It's what crops you grow, how you grow them, what animals you have. Is this an economic system? Does it work well? Is the technology the right technology? Are you having the right kind of investment, the right kind of flow, your debt level at a good system? And really, there's a lot of pressure to define resilience in this direction because it's easy to operationalize it in research and to derive clear recommendations. And we want that, and there's a lot of pressure to say, this is how you do it, this is how you recipe. If you structure your farm that way, and if you do this, you will be in for the long term. There are some assumptions underlying this model which I think are problematic. Essentially, the underlying structure explains behavior. That's structuralism. There is a structure underneath there that explains system behavior. We just need to find it. It might be complicated. It might be hidden, but it's there. We just need to find it. And if there's a structure and that structure is fairly predictable, we can predict the future. So prices will raise a bit or fall a bit, but essentially the structure tomorrow is going to be very much like today. A bit of change, something, but not fundamentally different. And there are not really surprises in there. And also what's seen there is that these mechanisms are understood as universal and fairly stable. That means, and economists are very good at that, it is always economic efficiency. Wherever you are, whatever farm you are, now it might be different how you make a farm efficient if it's a dairy or a crop farm, but it is always economic efficiency that's important. To all farms everywhere at all times. So in Austria as well as in Ethiopia, no difference at all times in Austria 10 years ago, in Austria in 50 years, it's all the same, it's economic efficiency. And farmers are very passive recipients of change. Essentially, they have no role. A farmer should, well, maybe he has a role is in doing his maths properly and his cost benefits calculations properly, but there is a real clear scheme how to do that. Now, usually, we're not very happy with not giving any role to farmers. And this does not explain heterogeneity by farmers, although economists will say it's just because they don't do it right. But if they would do it right, that would all be good. Now, then you move on to say, well, let's give the farmer a bit of agency in there, just a little, and then you start actually changing the definition of what makes a farm resilient. Then you have this process in there. It's something that I will expand on what process actually means. And here the farmers take an affect role. It's actually somebody who reflects, who learns, who changes, who makes meaning, who have ideas, and all these symbolic construction that sociologists quite like. And then the farmer suddenly has an active role in perceiving things, in making meaning of these things, and implementing change. Now, Jandao van der Ploeg has worked on the styles of farming, that's what he called them, and he actually demonstrated that you can have very successful farms. So Jandao works in the Netherlands, so it was mostly pig farmers, but also dairy farmers. And he showed that there are very successful farms that organize their farming process very differently. But they're all successful. They're all identified by farmers, and they say, yes, he's successful, but that's how he does it. And he's very different. They work in a different logic. They have a different coherence for their farm. So at least we have a bit of heterogeneity in there. And of course, nobody ever thinks that farmers can do what they want because, well, we still have winters, and that's when you can't grow anything. And so there are structural constraints we do acknowledge. The problem here is that still the underlying assumption, although it's not often necessarily voiced that way, is you still have that action lead to the intended effect. It's still actually fairly predictable what it's going to do. If I do this, it will lead to that. Cause effect is something that's very deep, I think, especially in scientists. Farmers, by the way, see things very differently. I really like that. But we want cause effect. That's what we're trained to find, cause effect. And we also believe, and that's still in there, that the difference between farms is a fairly stable pattern. So, okay, we have a heterogeneity, it's different, but that is then fairly stable. My problem is that I don't actually think that the world is stable and predictable. This builds strongly in this Newtonian mechanism sort of thing, the world as a clockwork. And we just need, clocks can be very complex. I don't know if you've ever taken them apart. They're very complicated. They're not actually complex, they're complicated. And we need to understand that. And that's still that, and if it works like a clockwork, even if a complicated one, It's broadly predictable. Now, economists will accept some risk in there, but risk is very narrowly defined. And I have a big problem with what risk is. You should read up how risk is defined. Is that all outcomes are known and probabilities are known. Now, I don't know in many cases that's true, except you go to the casino. In most other things, there are many different outcomes that are possible, and we have no way of knowing probabilities. And then you go into uncertainty and the unknown, actually. And now, the complex adaptive system is a very different way of viewing the world, and it's been around for quite a while. And essentially it says that the way things interact changes over time. Tomorrow is going to be radically different from today, and we have no way of knowing how tomorrow is going to be. And that changes a lot. Essentially, you need to acknowledge that there will be surprises. Surprises are essentially totally unexpected events you need to cope with. The future is not predictable. Rittel and Weber called it the wicked problems, the post-normal time, that's Funktovit and Ravet. So there are different authors who've pointed out that actually these assumptions that there are structures underneath that can show us that make the world predictable are problematic. And that's a more proverb, life happens while you make other plans. It's not difficult to think about how many things have happened that we really did not expect. I'm not that old, but back then there was a Cold War. It was actually extremely stable, and actually it never really was supposed to end. The fall of the Berlin Wall is something nobody expected. Now you can say, who cares? Why should an Austrian farmer care about that? Well, because 5 years later, we were in the European Union. That is a 120% different agriculture policy. It changed everything for farmers. And then we say, well, now we're in the European Union, that's nice. The European Union has a common agricultural policy, which is programmed for 7 years. So every 7 years, politicians come together and decide how farm policy is going to be this time, which is a really complex process. But you think at least you have 7 years. No, they don't have 7 years, because then 2003, there was a midterm review, and everything changed again. From subsidies to direct payments. Sounds like semiotics, but it isn't. It's very different. Recently, tragedy of Fukushima. Why on earth would an Austrian farmer care, except personally, for what happened in Fukushima? Fukushima happened at a time when the Germans, who had said they would go out of nuclear energy, were wavering and say, well, maybe we should stay in there. After Fukushima, that was it. They definitely got out. What does that mean? Renewable energy comes into the thing. What is renewable energy? It's farmers having energy crops. Whatever the Germans do, believe me, is going to affect the rest of the European Union and definitely the Austrians. And suddenly, there are new things that change. That's globalization. And do we see it coming? No. That's surprises. But that's just the big surprises. How about your wife suddenly getting ill, leaving you? That's a tragedy for a family farm. It's the same thing when the parents get sick. You really need them. You need their labor. They do that surprisingly. They don't necessarily allow you to plan for that. So essentially what that means is if we see the farm as a complex adaptive system, all these things keep changing all the time. It's not just climate change. It's the parents who suddenly want something, and the children who say, well, if you don't do this, I'm going to do something else. I met someone, I'm going to move away, so I plan to take over the farm in 2 years. I'm not going to do it afterwards. It's all the legal stuff, the paperwork. Recently, Brussels decided that the way Austria had administered a certain set of direct payment was not the way they had wanted it. And now all the farmers have to pay back direct payments in sums where the farmer says, I don't have that kind of money. How do you deal with that? That's just, these things get really messy. Part-time, off-farm job, all these things you need to manage. Then may or may not be there next year. The crops, the farms, the building, the machinery, the markets that change. All of this changes every time. So yes, usually there's a spring every year, and then it moves on to summer. But lately, the springs have been very short. Long winters, and suddenly it shifts to summer. How do we deal with that? And that's a fundamentally different understanding of how you manage your farm. Suddenly, it's not predictable, regular. Suddenly, it's your ability to deal with surprises. And that's farm management is a subdiscipline of agricultural economics, so that's where much of the thinking comes. It's about predicting. It's the optimal resource allocation. Oh, Yes, that's great fun. It's a command and control approach. You decide how it's going to be, and that's going to be optimal. And then you try to minimize the difference between what you do and what you should do. Very normative approach. It's strategic planning, isn't that great? Essentially, this is about seeking an effective solution to a predefined problem that is well-defined and end. That's how we think, and that's how we teach, actually, which I also think is a problem because it builds an assumption that I don't think reflect the real world. And then you shift to essentially the ability to cope with surprise, to adapt. That demands very different skills, a very different way of understanding your farm and your environment. There is a notion of bricolage that has been developed by Levi-Strauss. And essentially, it's a trial and error process with the resources at hand. But it's not just what you do. It's not just that little bricolage that you do in your workshop. It's also about tinkering without a predefined concept of the solution. Essentially, as you go, things develop, you have new ideas like, hey, now that's a really good idea, but that would allow me to do this. Wait, if I have this, I could then do that. Hey, that's interesting. But when you were here, you didn't see that happening. This emerged as you went. It's not only what you do in the resources, as in material resources, it's also exploring new ways of framing the situation. It's really about what does it mean? Where could it go? How could I frame this very differently? Humans, and that's a big difference with ecology. It's about how we perceive and what meaning we imply into things. Ecosystems, I understand, don't do that so much. And this is a part of the social ecological resilience that still needs quite a bit of work. So here, what it is, it's not so much of what you have, not that this is not important, but it's what you make of it. And that's a very different way of seeing it. And what you make of it is going to be what you make of it at a certain point in time in a specific context. 2 years later, very different game. We could play again. And essentially, this is where I come back to post-structuralism. Structuralism was this understanding that there was an underlying structure that determines behavior. And the word is important. It essentially says it determines behavior, cause, effect. This is what leads to this other one. And post-structuralism says, nah, there is no determination underneath this. There's always a struggle over meaning and interpretation. And by the time I've vaguely understood it, the situation has already changed and I need to adapt again. And there are always alternative interpretations possible. They always say there's an excess of possibilities. At any moment in time, there's always many more things that you could do that are possible. Whether or not you can think them is another question. Often we constrain ourselves to what is thinkable. But actually, there are many more things that you could do at any point of time. And then the question is how a farmer can make sense of this multiplicity of possibilities, because that can be bewildering. All these things, but paralysis by analysis, as we say. There are many things possible, so that doesn't help you necessarily to go along. And it's really, that comes from Deleuze, where he says it's about becoming, but you're always becoming. You never are. At no point in time are you something. You're always becoming something, and the question is, what is it that you're becoming? Others will call this a relational view. And I've put 3 groups here. Obviously, all of that is arbitrary. You could group it differently. But essentially, it's about having the farmer. And I'll keep talking about the farm. It's actually the farm family. And there's a lot of dynamic within this family that are actually quite complex. But it's about the projects that they have. It's the history they have together. It's their perception. It's their knowledge, experiential knowledge, but maybe also formal training. It's about the specific farm that they have, the materiality of that farm, the land, the buildings, the machinery, how old that is. It's always also the environment. I usually talk about context because the environment is often the natural environment, so let's put it the context. It's the networks, the kind of other farmers that are in the game, the markets, the policies. Obviously, an Austrian farmer with the direct payments that we have will have other possibilities than a Canadian farmer because just the policy, the markets are different. Now, one way, an analogy that is sometimes helpful is about really understanding it as a game of chess. Chess is very determined because you have a certain set of plays, and it's exactly that's a chessboard. But despite this fact that every piece can move just in one specific way, which is very narrow, chess games don't tend to repeat themselves. Because the importance of any piece in the chess game is only in relation to other pieces at that moment in time on that game. And whatever you can do is obviously constrained and influenced and enabled by what the other player does. In that case, there's only two players. Another way of seeing it is game of cards. It's actually a lot more complex because you don't always start with the same set of cards. It depends. But here too, it depends on what the other have and what you see as a possibility of playing, how good you play or how the others play. It's not determined. And again, a card is only important in relation to that particular game and depending on what the situation is. And that's there is no structure underlying this. You cannot determine, you cannot have an optimal strategy to win either a chess game or a card game, which is probably what makes them interesting. And it really depends what the farmers can do, always depends also what the other players can do. Now, the problem with that thing is it's not very helpful to say, well, it depends. So what should a farmer do to actually be resilient? Well, it depends. I think that's actually the answer, but it's not very satisfactory. I don't know why. So what we're trying now is to identify, based on many interviews with farmers where we ask them their history and what they think allows them or others, but mostly themselves, to persist over time. We're trying to go for rules of thumb. That's a rule of thumb. It's very precise. So what we try now is something, these are very tentative for now, and they're certainly not, they're not an exhaustive list. It's about maintaining balance. Extremes are usually not good unless you balance one extreme with another. But between specialization and diversification, that's an interesting one, because usually resilience says, well, diversity is better. And you go to a farmer and you say, well, diversity is good. And he's going to answer, yeah, but manage diversity. And that's a challenge in itself. Many different things, that's many different expertises, that many things that can go wrong. Hey, I only have 24 hours a day, and really, I should sleep somewhere in here. So really, that doesn't work. And what most farmers do is they mix. They specialize, I'm going to say a number, but that's totally arbitrary, 80% of their energy in something, but they always have 20% where they do other things. Again, a balance here. Between exploitation and exploration, because when you exploit something, an activity on your farm that works really well, you'd be really stupid not to really make that work. If that's what the market demands, you get a high price for that, well, definitely keep going. But you always need to keep exploring for new opportunities and see what happens. Have something on the back burner. You never quite know if it's going to turn out, but you try out little things, and eventually maybe it will develop in something larger, or maybe not. But you have that option. It's always a balance between the short and the long term, and especially for family farmers, that is the long term. You don't minimize on the short term. It's not the quarterly reports that are important in farming. It's always also because income and work satisfaction, so you don't maximize income. Hey, you live on it, you want to have fun also. And it's obviously also work-life balance. So there are many of these lists, but it's essentially a sense of balancing, of avoiding extremes. It's a sense of keeping options open. Never close a door unless you open another one. You don't make choices that are going to put you in a ditch. You make choices that are going in, at least likely open other choices. So you enable new relations to emerge. You keep redundant resources. I love that with farmers. They always have things where I'm like, what do you do with this? I went and interviewed a farmer, and he had an old building there that obviously served no particular purpose, and I asked him whether he uses it. And no, it's not been used for years. And I said, well, why don't you get rid of it? I mean, it's actually in the way. You know, you could drive around with your tractor a lot. He said, why don't you get rid? You never know. You just never know. Because maybe one day you'll need it as a storage room, and that'll be quite handy to have. This is this bricolage approach. It's the redundancy. Economists hate redundancy because they're per definition not efficient. You always maintain a buffer. This is a huge challenge for most farmers that we interviewed, is maintaining a buffer. That's mostly related to their work. They usually work their 60 hours, 80 hours a week. And then eventually, if something happens, they have no buffer. And something always happens. Often it's the mother-in-law that's sick and that suddenly needs treatment, and you need to take care of her. And then suddenly, how do you do it? Because you have direct marketing, and you have your crops, and you have your field, and it just doesn't work anymore. Burnout is a huge problem that we have with farmers, and it's really maintaining that balance also. And the other thing is autonomy, ability to still make decisions, to really make sure that you can change if it does seem opportune to you. Enable self-organization, that's an interesting one, linked typically to organic farming. It's about the fact that you can't be everywhere all the time. So rather than micromanaging everything, set them up in such a way that you don't actually have to micromanage, because they will essentially keep within a certain bandwidth by themselves. If you have a good soil organic matter in your soils, essentially that works well. Habitats for antagonist insects, nutrient cycle, that allows you not to micromanage much of what's going on. Not pushing your dairy cow to go for the 15,000 liters in a lactation period will mean that she will just not be that sick. It's as simple as that. You'll have her for longer. But it's also nurture flow of ideas. Again, it's not just the material, it's always also the ideas, networks. Discuss observation. What's changing? How do you see? What are the trends that you see? What do I see? Could we do something? Is that a threat? Is that an opportunity? And ensure healthy relations in the family. Again, these are family farm. The family is really important. You want to have a happy spouse, husband or wife, and you want to make your children happy. The biggest problem why farms do not get passed on is because they're not happy. The children do not feel that they can express their projects on the farm, mostly because the parents think that you must do it that way. That tend to be very constraining. It's not economics. I asked farmers, and they say, no, you have farms that do very well in economics. There are very small farms that can never be economical. Some are taken over because the children feel that this is something that can make something out of, and they want to do that. But obviously, all of that is not just easy peasy. There's a lot of contestation in there, and what we should do, and how we should interpret things, and how we should shift things around. So these rules of thumb are really not recipes, and they're very different from recipes because they actually don't tell you what to do. They just tell you about things that you should keep an eye on, but how you actually implement them is totally open to interpretation. And it depends a lot on local contingencies and what the farmers want and don't want and how they want to do things. And it's really, again, all about the relations that you have, networking, working that net, networks of relations. And really it comes down to three questions. What relations do you want to engage in? What relation do you see? What potentials do you have? And do these relations, because there are many of them on your farm, actually form a coherent whole at the farm level? If not, the thing gets very difficult to manage. And are they flexible? Can you undo and redo others? If they get rigid and you get trapped, then your resilience is also gone, no matter what relations you have, because they will need to change. Here, just as a comparison between two farms, let's put this one as a conventional farm in the modernization paradigm, and this one as an organic farm in the principles of organic farming. It's not difficult to find farms that work both ways. I mean, that work like this or that work like that. A modernization farm is dependent on input. It purchases all their inputs on the market. That means it's dependent. An organic farm will try to close nutrient cycle. It will try to produce the feed it needs for the cows on farm and to close the nutrient cycles, not have more cows than you can actually distribute the manure on your own farm. It's about scientific expertise. Modernization is dependent on, essentially it becomes a recipe. That's how you need to do it. That's the fertilizer, the pesticide you need to apply, calendar spraying. Where did that come from? It's some kind of scientist who define it. Organic is more about experiential knowledge. It's about knowing your fields and your crops and your animals and understanding how they work. This works on economies of scale. As I said, it's a get big or get out. That's all that really drives this paradigm. Here it's about economies of scope. It's about looking for synergies, things that work well together. Spread your risk. Have an off-farm job if that seems to work. Have tourism on your farm. Very different streams of income, totally unrelated to each other, works well. That usually works with that. These things are linked. These are logics that don't seem to necessitate each other, but in practice, it's one whole. That usually means debt. That means lack of autonomy. You have to service your debt. There you go, bricolage. You just adapt it. It's not going to be elegant, but who cares for stainless steel? It's going to work. And you don't have a debt, which means you can change it afterwards. This is about specialized. You produce large quantity of a standardized commodity. You usually have very few market outlets, and you usually compete on the world market. It can work. I'm not saying it doesn't work. But if something happens on the world market, there's very little you can do. And the organic farm is usually a lot more diversified because they need that for their crop rotation anyway. They need that to close their nutrient cycle. This sort of leads to that very directly. And they usually have a very diverse and unrelated sources of income. So if one doesn't work, it's not a big problem. You have the other things that work, and they sort of compensate each other. So really that post-structuralist view means that resilience is a lot more the ability to maintain relations and build new ones. Again, it's not about having the right set of relation because there is no right set. It's what works for you at that point in time, and you will need to change that over time. It's about interpreting change and being responsive to that change, making sense, making meaning out of that. But that means that you cannot actually reduce resilience to measurable farm characteristics. What you would do if you measure the resilience of a farm is you check on what cards someone has at one point in time in the game. And how much is that going to tell you whether that person is going to win the card game or not? I doubt you can say much about that. Because it doesn't tell you what the other have in their card. It doesn't tell you how the person will play their card. It doesn't actually tell you very much. Again, it doesn't mean it's not important. It means it's not determining whether that will make a resilient farm. So it's really the ability of the farmer to make sense of potential relations, of indeterminacy, and of complexity. That's not easy, although actually I find that most farmers in practice do it extremely well. They're very creative with that. Oh, I don't know, but we'll see. And they give you answers that make it very difficult for you to fill out your questionnaire because it's between and a bit of both. It's not what you want. But it works. So really, it's an ongoing enactment of social, of material, and of meaning relations. And this to capture, there is no way you can really capture this in something that you can measure. And I think that will make it very difficult for us to ever define a measure quantifying whether that farm is resilient or not resilient. And that's leaving aside all the discussion about generalized and specified resilience, about how you change over time. Does it mean if a farm was resilient in the past, how much of that does it mean whether it's going to be resilient in the future? All these questions are still very open, and I'm not sure we'll ever be able to have a clear set of recommendations. It's a lot more a state of mind and a way of approaching what farming means. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you for that very stimulating talk. So we want to time for questions? I have a few. So in general, in your talk, I enjoyed it very much. But I've had a bit of trouble sort of like disentangling what your normative perspective is, like what you think is good and what you think is less good, and like and your findings. So, for example, like you were saying how it seems like from your normative point of view, losing farms is bad. So you gave all the examples of cultural stuff and like cutting down maybe rural landscapes and all that stuff. But it seems that farms, and you gave the example like it could be inherent to farm, they're not going to sell the farm. But it seems like someone is selling farms if the graph goes down of the number of farms. So I was just wondering about that.
So yes, my normative assumption is it's not going to lose farms for all the reasons that I've cited. We have fewer farms that rarely get sold. I'm not saying they never get sold. They rarely get sold. What happens is just that two families merge. And somebody who inherits a farm marries somebody who also inherits a farm, and eventually they put these farms together. And then legally, statistically, it becomes one farm. farmers in Austria will sell a piece of land and another piece of land. They rarely sell the whole farm, which is the problem why we don't have a succession. We have a problem with new entrants. There are no farms on the market. You can't buy a farm, assuming you had the money, and that's another issue. The other thing that often what does happen, obviously, is one piece goes, another piece goes. You have enough alcoholism problem, whatever, and when the family doesn't work, eventually you have alcohol, you start selling one bit of land, another bit of land, eventually you have nothing left. Yes, so that farm disappeared and was sold bit by bit over 15 years. So yes.
The other question I have is about marginal land being ecosystem services. So, mentioned that, yeah, so that small farmers will farm marginal lands that would be very and but I was just reminded my ecosystem services class that often takes for ecosystem services programs will target those kinds of marginal lands in order to take them out of production because they produce ecosystem services in a way when they're not plowed.
I think these lands are not plowed, they're grassland. And if you take them out of production, they are forest grows. And then you lose the biodiversity. The biodiversity that's established in all of the alpine area in the mountains is essentially heavily dependent on actually being grazed or mowed or grazed, whatever it is. If you don't do that, you lose all the biodiversity in these alpine meadows. And all our biodiversity is in these alpine meadows. If you count the number of species, they're in these alpine meadows, which are already massively under pressure due to climate change, so the frost limit goes up. But essentially, we need to have these lands being managed, and there's substantial direct payment to keep them being managed, to keep having cows that eat them, or mowed. I mean, some of that you can't mow because there is very little there. So you actually need to have the cows on the alpine meadows over the summer. And that's extremely low productive. I mean, you can't say half of these alpine meadows are not electrified, so there's no electricity, which means if you have dairy cows up there, you need to milk them by hand, which is an interesting activity. But yes, that's the only way you're going to keep them from afforestation and to keep that biodiversity. No. They would not stay that way for long. I mean, they would stay that way for 5 or 6 years, obviously. I mean, it does take a while until all the shrubs and the trees grow there. And above the tree line, you obviously don't have them. But again, the composition of the species changes if you change the management. That's empirically, it's a very difficult question. Simply in Austria, we don't have commercial farms. Okay, probably we have 20, I don't know. They haven't been around long enough for me to assess whether or not they will resist or not. Internationally, there are more. I have never seen a study of how long a commercial farm persists. Usually, few of them are older than 10 years. We're talking 400. There are substantial evidence from the private sector, not farming, private sector, that companies just don't last long. What's the oldest company on the market? They're just never that long. often the brands are still on the market, and they have very nice studies about, I don't know, what would be old brands. I mean, Nestle has been around for a while. How long is that? So Nestle seems to be pretty good, but the adaptive strategies of private companies on the private sector generally, and you see that most companies, they have a high and then they lose. I mean, look at what happens in, I don't know, computers. Wang was a big thing at the beginning of computers. They're gone. Apple's one was nearly gone, now it's back. What do I know what's going to come on? Usually these brands stay, the companies disappear. They get bought up or not. Will they really, I don't think they're sustainable. Most of the commercial farms that I see are not sustainable, ecologically and financially. Will they be there in 10 or 15 years? My question is, I don't think they want to be there. They're there as long as there's money to be made. That's a commercial farm. You invest, you make money. If you're going to get more money elsewhere, you disinvest and you put your money there. There is no tie to the land or the region. I think the logic behind it is very different. Does that mean that this commercial farm was not viable? What is the system under consideration? Is that money that got invested, that just get disinvested, different relation built with the same money? Because the person who owns that, I mean, look at what happens with all the land grabbing. They're not there on the long term. I don't think they're going to be there in 50 years. And the land, the way it's going to look afterward, they don't care. Now, then the question again, when you look at farm resilience, it's very important to define what your system is. What is a farm? Is that the family and the land and the building? Is that an economically viable unit? Is that what we're talking about? So if it suddenly, that farm turns into actually a hotel, but still has sheep that eat the grass, is that still a farm, or have we now shifted to something else? It's very difficult, and that's behind that question. Personally, I think that the argument that commercial farms will last for a long time is something that I can only build on the evidence from the private sector. And there are enough studies about how long companies on average in the private sector, whatever sector it is, last. And they don't usually last long, because they have a competitive advantage at one particular time. And most companies, they're very good at a particular time and then things change. And most of these companies don't manage to change with it. And then the big ones, they buy small ones to stay competitive for a while. And those who don't do that fast enough, they disappear and somebody else comes up. It's been a while I've been to the developing world. I lived there for 16 years in Africa. I grew up in Africa. So that's the continent I would know best. I don't know much about Southeast Asia or South America. I think I did my PhD thesis in Ethiopia. Honestly, the amount of creativity the farmers have there is enormous. I do not think that any of us would manage to do anything under these conditions, and they actually do it. So actually, I think they are extremely resilient. But, as I say, it's not just about the farm. You only can do a certain number of things, and it depends on your context. When I was in Ethiopia, it was in '94, they had just come out of a civil war. Good luck. I mean, policies a mess, and markets a mess, and instability a mess. Under these conditions, you're happy to keep your family alive. And the point is, most of them actually manage to do that. Now, then you have a trade-off with the long term. They tend to not invest enough in the long term. That's the contour, that's the erosion problem. And I think there are very interesting study in Australia. I'm switching context, but I think it's relevant, where essentially the way the policy changed in Australia linked to the drop of the dairy quota and to the drought, and certain policies that changed, essentially that totally eroded the resilience of the farm. So that was a study that came in, I think it was 15 years after the stop of the dairy quota, and the number of dairy farm was less than half of what's there. And it's not that the farmer lost their resilience. The environment changed in such a way that for them there was no way to do it. So essentially the policies had eroded the ability of the farms to be resilient. And then that was it. And I would think that in many of these contexts, the framework is so problematic that there's eventually nothing you can do. So you can never say that I am resilient no matter what my context offers. It's always in relation to that context. And if in the context, out of various thoughts, wants to get you out, eventually it will be very difficult for you to stay there. So I think I've focused a lot on the farm and what a farmer can do, but really, and that's very important, what can policy do to strengthen farm resilience is just as well an important question. And I think that these framework conditions, policies, markets, you have the whole modernization paradigm is a problem. All of economics is a problem because they want them out. There is a lot of power play in there also. I mean, these things are important for what farmers can still do. So I think the farmers themselves are resilient, and given them a bit different policy context, they could do a lot of things. But the context don't allow them to express that resilience. That would be my preliminary answer. I would settle with the we shouldn't. I think I increasingly have a problem with science trying to put things in determining things. It's all this cause and effect. If this happens, then that. If a farm is like that, whatever that may or may not be, then it will be resilient. We really are very strongly into that thing, and I don't think that this kind of thinking allows us to deal with complex adaptive systems. That's it. They're very well for a certain class of problems, and I think that's what science got to us where we are currently, with all the benefits and the drawbacks of it. But we do not capture complex adaptive systems. And I think that we need a different way of thinking in science to deal with CAS. And we are nowhere there. And we don't teach it. And we don't put a lot of energy into it, as in research funding, because the questions, we want to stay in that one framework that we have built for ourselves over the last centuries. And I do think that we need to go past out there. I mean, in farm management, I don't think there is a chair for farm management anywhere. Why? Because scientists go into complex economical model because that's what they can publish, and farmers say that this is of no relevance to them. So we're doing things that are nice in the academia, but have no relevance for the real world because the real world just isn't the way we put it into our models. It's a lot more dynamic, it's a lot more changing, and the tools that we have in our Newtonian science are just not adequate for a world that starts changing really fast. Now we can discuss globalization and what that means or doesn't mean, but I think it's not adequate. And trying to force a structure on a world that keeps changing is where I really struggle with that. Absolutely. But then we're at this farmer-farm question, what's the unit of analysis? And I do think that's extremely important to understand what our unit is. And yes, for a particular farmer, it might be best for him or her to leave and seek work elsewhere. And I'm not the one who says whether that should or should not be the case. What I'm observing is if that happens, and it happens, then we have rural areas that essentially start a rural decline. We have ecological consequences that we don't usually want. And that's a problem. And I also see at the same time young people want to start farming who don't get in. I'm not sure that many really people don't want to farm. What they don't want is farm under their parents looking behind their shoulder all the time and telling them what to do. That's a different thing. And I don't know if I go out there, and interestingly enough, I think resilience is a concept that I find much more problematic communicating to scientists than farmers. If I go to a farmer and say, it depends, he says, of course it depends. If I go to a scientist and say, a policymaker, oh, well, it depends, I can't work with that. What exactly do you want me to do? How should I do it? What relations? What flexible? You say flexible, how flexible? How do I measure flexibility? But this is all these metrologies that we're so working on. Foucault loves this stuff. It's all power. It's all state domination. By putting and measuring everything, that means it's controllable. We have to think about what we're doing as scientists when we buy into this need to measure, control, causality on everything. And I mean, this is now the big philosophical question, what do we do as a scientist, and how helpful are we for the real world out there? Whatever that may or may not be. I mean, it's always subjective on what it is, and I personally don't come from a farming background, so I kind of work with people who come from that background and try to understand them. I didn't even grow up in Austria, so I think they're strange people over there. But it helps me try to point out things and talk to them. But I think that the best thing that I could do with farmers is really, first of all, strengthen them in the feeling that they need to find their own way. Most of these farmers fight against a system that tells them there is one right solution and this is what it is. And many of these farmers are trying to say, but that's not really what I want to do. These are not my values. That's not my project. I don't want to grow big and eat my neighbor. I want to work with him or her. And alone, if I would be able to strengthen them and say diversity is good. And if you want to be very income-oriented, That's one way to be a farmer. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, because I do actually believe in diversity between farms. And I think that if we look at farming in a region that's yet another scale, it'd be good if we had a couple of commercial farms in there. What I'm saying is, it's probably not a good idea if all farms are commercial. Actually, there'll probably be one farm left. That's what I don't think is good. Again, it's about extremes. And if I say, well, think about these things, think them through. Does that work for you? What impact is going to have elsewhere in your life? If you thought it through and you think it works, go ahead. And by the way, think it through regularly. Don't make a plan and then just implement that plan. I think that would be more something that farm extension should be looking towards. We have what's called AKIS in Europe. It's called the Agricultural Knowledge and Information System. It's really about going away from this model of extension where extension agents, we still have them, they're government, more or less government employees, and they go out there and they give advice to farmer. What do they say? Modernization. That's the breed you're going to have, and you have to feed them that kind of feed that often. This is what you have. Extremely normalized advice. Well, how about rather having a group of farmer and, being more a facilitator? What do you want? What would help you? What information do you know? Let me bring you that information. It's a very different understanding of extension, about the work, about extension. It would be a very totally different understanding of agricultural education. It's about understanding what you want and helping you concretize what you want for your farm, rather than saying, this is how you should farm. This is the breed, this is the feed, this is the antibiotics you need to give them, and that's how you do it. And many farmers, some farmers want to do this CAFO thing, where they get the pigs, and that's how you need to feed them, and after 15 days, that's what you need to see. And if some are happy with that, as long as not all of them do that, I suppose the environment would also be able to absorb that kind of farms. I just don't see many farmers wanting to do that. Most of the farmers, they have their project, want to try out things. Not always, because sometimes get too much, and sometimes you want to go into a certain routine. But it's a different understanding about what farming is about and what probably work is about. It's about realizing your ideas and your project and seeing how these change, and you get older, you have different projects, you have new people there, new relations that you can have. I think it's really a shift in understanding what farming is about. And it's a more integrative thing. And it's interesting when I asked even farmers there about the landscape, and they say, but that's their landscape. And when they go mow these weird places which are difficult to cut, you actually need to cut them by hand, and it's hot, but that's what they want. Because I say that's where I look out every day out of my window. And that's a landscape I grew up with, and I want to maintain that. But we never captured this element of quality of life, or giving meaning, and what makes you get up every morning. And I think these are all elements that we don't capture, but that make up farm resilience, definitely in the context of family farms. But I was alone.
I would just throw in that it has to be a broader project as well, because I'm reading a lot about these structural transformation in order. The point of food security programs is that you provide lots of other things for people to do in the economy other than grow food. And it's at least observationally true that the more people you be a social conversation, not just what the farmers want, but what do we all want? Because we want certain things like food security, we want certain, and I don't know, the cultural richness that comes from diversification. So I just think that there's a big conversation there about it. I think in Europe, a lot of people say, yeah, we're willing to pay a lot of money to these few farms because they give us so much else. But I don't think other places either have had that luxury yet or have had that conversation. I don't know if Canada has issues yet on where farms play a role in
I mean,
postmodern age.
and I think in some ways maybe Austria is particular, but it's really amazing how much money we're willing to throw at farmers. And it's and in the yearly discussion on the national budget, this item in the budget is never questioned. No matter who's in power, no matter how the parliament looks like, that question is out of debate. You want to give them, you give it to them. I know that when we joined the EU, 95, the EU does a lot of co-financing, so the more government can put money, the more the EU will co-finance. And at the beginning, because we're a new member state, they didn't look so closely, so that was fun, and we went ahead. But after the second round, they said, well, we'll have to stop this because we actually drew so much money for the second pillar, as it's called, from Brussels, that they say, hey, let's leave some for the others. So it's just Austria is willing to put a lot of money on that. I'm not a cultural anthropologist. I don't know why Austria just loves its landscape, its farm, and we know it's the farmers that produce that, and we're an extremely, by statistical means, we're a very rural population, a very rural country, and I sometimes think that everybody still knows a farmer, and we want them to stay there. I don't know. It's the national identity. I don't know what it is. But yes, and probably this understanding that these farmers, even if they're just 2% of the population, they're just important. And most of them are part-time farmers. I mean, even in Austria with 19 hectares, no matter how much money is thrown on you, just can't live. So they're part-time farmers, and there's a lot of work to enable that part-time farming, and a lot of exemptions in the tax system for farmers, and all sorts of things. But yes, it allows us to maintain things that other countries have lost, maybe, in Europe. But it's always a bit a difficult comparison, I think.
Thank you so much.
So I'm still here until early July, so anybody who is willing and interested to talk with me, I'm here. I'm very flexible because, I'm on sabbatical. No teaching, no admin, it's yes! So just send me an email, and I'm very happy to talk with everybody and about every subject. I'm not saying I'm going to say something helpful or sensible, but I'll try.